I'm Al McFarland. Welcome to the conversation with Al McFarland. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. As promised, I believe you're going to experience what I call a robust conversation. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to be having with Michael Sierra-Arévalo, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and associate director of the Liberal Arts Honors Program at the University of Texas at Austin. We're talking about his new book. It's entitled The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing. The book shows how policing's preoccupation with danger shapes police culture and violence in this country. Sierra-Arévalo's research is published in leading journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Criminology, Law and Society Review, and the Annual Review of Law and Social Science. His writing and research are widely featured in media, including the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Times Higher Education, Slate, GQ, and NPR. He received his PhD in sociology from Yale University and his BA in sociology and psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. Before I bring him on, I want you to like the program and tell somebody. If you're listening on any of the social media networks we have, we're streaming live to LinkedIn, to Twitter, to Facebook, and to YouTube platforms. We want you to let somebody know. Let us know you're there. Shout us out with a comment, letting us know your name and where you're watching or viewing or connecting from. But tell other people about it as well. And we want you to subscribe, help us grow our numbers for this platform, this program. We're trying to do the bean counting on our YouTube channel. So if you go over to YouTube, Insight News MN, you'll find our live stream there. That's the one we want you to click on to subscribe and like and share. But we're happy to be connecting with you wherever you are and however you join the program. And we thank you so much. Well, let me bring in Michael Sierra-Arévalo. Brother, thank you so much. And is it Dr. Sierra-Arévalo? Of course it is.
It is, Al. Yes. Thank you for having me.
And what do you prefer? I can call you Dr. Sierra.
You know what? We can just go with Michael. That's totally fine.
Okay. And please call me Al. So
absolutely.
We keep things rolling. So let me, I told you before we started that I loved the liner notes on your book. And if you don't mind, let me indulge myself and the audience a little bit by reading some of the liner notes. I think they're really excellent.
Yeah, please.
And you can probably show this, Cooper, so people can follow along. The liner notes say the danger imperative, violence, death, and the soul of policing. That's the title of the book. It says policing is violent, and its violence is not distributed equally. Stark racial disparities persist, despite decades of efforts to address them. Amid public outcry and an ongoing crisis of police legitimacy, there's a pressing need to understand not only how police perceive and use violence, but also why. With unprecedented access to 3 police departments and drawing on more than 100 interviews and 1,000 hours on patrol, the danger imperative provides vital insight into how police culture shapes officers' perception and practice of violence. From the front seat of a patrol car, it shows how the institution of policing reinforces a cultural preoccupation with violence through academy training, through departmental routines, through powerful symbols, and officers' street-level behavior. This violence-centric culture makes no explicit mention of race, rather relying on the colorblind language of threat and officer safety. Nonetheless, existing patterns of systemic disadvantage funnel police hyper-focused on survival into poor minority neighborhoods, and without requiring individual bigotry, this combination of social structure, culture, and behavior perpetuates enduring inequalities in police violence. It goes on to say, this is a trailblazing underground account of modern policing, this book shows that violence is the logical consequence of an institutional culture that privileges officer survival over public safety. Wow, what a statement. What a powerful statement. And thank you for making it. Let me have you jump right in and talk about the motive, the intent, and what you hope will be the impact of this discussion, this analysis, and this examination of violence, death, and the soul of policing.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Al. Sincerely, thank you. I began working on the danger imperative as a graduate student in 2014 after Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson. And at the time, I, like many other people, was pretty shocked to find out that we didn't know seemingly very basic things about US policing, such as how many people were shot by the police every year. We now have those numbers because of journalists and nonprofits that have crowdsourced that information. But at the time, we simply did not know. We had estimates from individual departments. It turns out that at the time, we didn't even have a good count of the number of officers. We didn't have a census that was accurate. We now have an updated one, and now that one is almost 5 years old. So I was coming to learn how fraught it was to try to study police with official administrative data. We have a huge data problem in the US when it comes to policing. But there were some really important ethnographies, meaning participant observations, spending time with police, that were written back in the 1970s. And those were really important for forming my questions. And I thought, you know what, if they could do it in the 1970s and get in a car and try to understand police from the ground up, I should be able to do that too. And I thought that was a better way to understand the how and the why of police violence, as opposed to just where it happens and to whom it happens. And that's why I started getting into a police car and talking with officers. And so you fast forward after all these ride-alongs, 1,000 hours with officers in these departments across 3 cities, on Elmont on the East Coast, West River on the West Coast, Sunshine in the Southwest. These are all pseudonyms. I came to the conclusion that violence is at the core of what the policing institution is. This is not so much a value judgment as it is a description. It's an observation. Violence is, when rubber meets road, the most important thing in policing, both in terms of what officers are thinking about and guarding against, and also in terms of what they themselves produce, their own violence. And so what I hope the book can do is show people that this is not a story of monsters. This is a story of men. This is a story of people in a system responding predictably to the structure around them, the training, the culture. And that leads to predictable behaviors that, because of the way we have structured policing, ends up privileging police officer safety over the well-being of the public, including innocence.
And would you have it any other way? Right now, Minnesota, as we speak, is viewing the memorials to 3 officers, 2 police officers and a first responder who were killed last week responding to a domestic call, and a person who had 7 children and a spouse holed up in a housing unit, ended up firing several, I think 100 rounds at officers, killing the 3. And so this community, as we speak, is in a moment of high sensitivity and awareness about officer safety. And it's grieving, and it should be grieving. And how does that fit into the analysis, though, about the overall and underlying attitude about danger, the danger imperative?
Sure. The killings in Minnesota are tragic, and all killings of police officers are a tragedy, and they are right to be mourned, and they are right to be memorialized. What I write about in The Danger Imperative is that, as tragic as these individual incidents are, the pattern over time is actually one of increasing safety for police officers. And that's actually the puzzle at the heart of the book. It's, well, if the injuries and deaths of police officers are decreasing over time, why does this culture oriented around violence and threat persist so strongly and so consistently? And what I suspect is happening, I don't know because I'm not on the ground with officers right now, but I was there, for example, when the Dallas shootings happened, and this is what I saw, is that the instances of officers that are killed in Minnesota are being talked about in departments across the country. They are on news channels across the country. They're talked about on Police One and other popular police websites. They're on Facebook accounts, and they are held up as an example of just how dangerous policing is. No matter what you might think, there is no way around the fact that officers are killed in the line of duty. And they're killed in the line of duty more than other countries, to be very clear. These individual examples are used to recreate and reify the necessity of a cultural frame that I describe in the book as the danger imperative, the title of the book. And the frame, you can think of it sort of like glasses or a lens that you might use. And this is a violence tinted lens. This is one that is centered on the preoccupation with violence and officer safety. So when you have examples in Minnesota or in Dallas, you might be on the other side of the country, on the West Coast. But these cases serve as dramatic reminders that this is the kind of violence that might strike at any moment on the streets that you patrol, whether or not Minneapolis or Dallas or the officers that were killed there have any direct connection to those particular departments.
And so you started off saying that when you began, there was not a lot of data about the demography or the census of police departments, police officers around the country, and particularly about their interaction and deaths caused by police or police deaths. I think all of that is probably true. Why was that so? Is that a fair description of what you found?
So the specific data that we didn't have was the number of people that were shot by the police. We now have better numbers on people who are shot. Those are fatal cases, which of course leaves out a large number of shootings that are non-fatal. The simple answer is that there is just a lack of political will to collect that data at the federal level. There have been promises, I believe, for well over 60 years at this point, but let's just call it 50 to be safe, half a century of promises to create a federal database of police officer use of lethal force. And it has never happened. The federal government has never made good on that promise, in large part because they can't force local police departments to report that information.
Why can't they?
The short answer is federalism. The federal government can't tell local government what to do, right? As long as the local government's obeying the law, they can't force them to do that stuff. Now, theoretically, things could happen that could change that. You could potentially tie those things to funding, sort of a carrot and a stick kind of thing. But those options have not been pursued as far as I know. And so it's always been a voluntary process. And to date, we have never had reporting at the level that was necessary to have reliable or useful data on things like lethal force.
Before and as you embarked on this research, had you considered the whole nature and notion, the reason for policing and police policy in the United States? What's the historical framework about why we have police forces? What do you mean, Al? Well, if I'm just going on, what I remember as a kid 70 years ago watching TV, the idea of policing was, first of all, the good cowboys versus, the bad guys in Western towns. One was the sheriff, the white earp, the type characters who always did good, and they always had the mortal face-off with the guys who ended up on Boot Hill. Then you had the next iteration of public policing or justice in, the gangster type movies in the 30s and 40s. So this is what the ambient information provides the casual, unintentional observer about how violence happens. Good cops use their guns back in the Wild West days, and then in the 40s and 50s and gangster days, Prohibition and beyond, you have to use force to root out evil and bad. And so that's always been part of how we see the role of police. What's not discussed, and you mentioned it in your note here, was the intersection between that idea of protecting and representing good, how that intersects with its impact on people of color, and how there's been a code switching that allows things to happen to us that we see through the lens of our culture and skin that we see don't happen to other people, that society tends to protect and to protect them from us at the end of the day. What do you think? I'm kind of rambling, but throwing out stuff for you to talk to.
Sure. I think that what you are pointing to here is that there is a hidden history of policing in the US. I think like probably most people in the country, I grew up just kind of watching TV shows and movies, and my idea of the police was something that was rooted in very romantic notions of what the police institution is and who police are. And so, just like a lot of people, my understanding of police was from cops, and I'm dating myself here, but like NYPD Blue, The Shield, right? They're just shows, right? And they were dramas. And so from that perspective, policing is all car chases and catching gang members and murderers and gunfights. And that's not what policing is, even today. But similarly, we're sort of obfuscating, hiding what the root of the police institution is in the US and frankly in other nations. The US is not unique in that the origins of policing is to protect capital and to protect the interests of the ruling class. In the US, that history is deeply tied to slavery. Some of the earliest forms of what you might call very early policing, this is long before uniforms and badges, were slave patrols. And they were used to patrol areas of the South to monitor, terrorize, and then catch people who were enslaved who ran away and to bring them back. They were there to essentially guard against the possibility of slave uprisings. And the North is not excused from this. The North and its early departments later also participated in returning runaways. So they were not themselves enforcing slavery per se in colonies and in early states where there was no slavery or where slavery was illegal. But they certainly weren't doing anything about it, so to speak. Those departments eventually became much more formalized. Even after emancipation, those departments formed. They got uniforms, they got badges and buildings. Black folk were shut out of those departments in ways that were systematically different from the eventual inclusion of Irish immigrants and German immigrants into the police force. That is an uncomfortable history for some to wrestle with. And we're not even getting to something like the Texas Rangers in killing Mexican people and natives along the Texas border, right? That's a history that was hidden from me, and I'm from here. I went to public schools here in Texas. But the Texas Rangers are just the guys in the white hats and Walker Texas Ranger. And that's the version that I knew about that. And so there is a hidden, bloody, and very, very sad history of how policing has been used. And it would be imprecise to say that it is exactly the same today. But it would also be imprecise to say that it's wholly different today. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
I'm Al McFarland. You're listening to The Conversation with Al McFarland. My guest is Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. He is the author of The Danger Imperative, a book that we're talking about today. The book examines police violence, its impact in society, impact on the officers as well. And Michael has spent hours riding along with officers and interviewing officers in three major departments in the country. One of the questions comes up, Michael, is when you have an incident like the murder of George Floyd, from my point of view as an observer, journalist, and a Black man, I always expect the political and cultural and white establishment to say that this is a one of, it's just a particular bad apple, one bad cop, that you can't paint the entire force or the industry with the failure and the imperfection of this one human being who failed in a very public way. So is this a question about police violence reflecting that there are some bad apples in police forces around the country, but that by and large, policemen are just, regular old Ozzie and Harriet type guys, good guys that come to do a good job every day, and they're pretty jovial and pretty caring and compassionate, and they want to make sure everybody gets home and that they want to get home themselves because they deserve it. It's a job. So there's that perception that lends you to be compassionate towards them, but you also have an institutional response describing that as the nature of who they are and what they do. But the evidence of their work tells a different story.
One of the main points that I try to drive home in the danger imperative is that the violence that we see out in the world used by police, whether it be abhorrent violence like that by Derek Chauvin in Minnesota, which led to the murder of George Floyd, or Michael Slager in South Carolina, who shot Scott in the back as he was running away, and we could keep naming cases. And the far more common non-lethal violence, the violence that is grabbing and pushing and handcuffing, and the vast majority of which is legal, which is within the law and within policy. All of this is tied to officers' preoccupation with their safety. So this is not a book that's just trying to explain the catastrophes, the shootings. It's actually a book that's trying to understand the day in and day out perception and use of violence by police officers. And importantly, it's not a story about bad apples. This is not a story about particularly bad people that become police officers. Those people certainly exist. Just give it a quick Google and you can find all sorts of instances of abhorrent racists that are still working in police departments. The FBI has reported overt links between police departments and white supremacist groups. But what I would ask readers to consider, and what I write about in the book, is that imagine we had a perfect filtering system. We had a perfect test, and we took out all the racist cops. And so we had perfectly egalitarian police in uniform, completely unbiased. If you don't address broader inequalities, segregation, broken schools, unemployment, it turns out the rest of society is still deeply structured by race. It turns out that race still predicts a whole lot of things in the world around us, including things like crime and violence, which is what police are called to address. And so police who are preoccupied with their safety and with the possibility of violence are still going to systematically go into poor minority communities. And so when they get there, they are going to encounter individuals and they are going to be on guard for threat. Now, let's layer on top the biases that we know exist. It is perfectly logical to expect disparities in violence when you understand the underlying culture of police and how that is practiced by individual officers within a system that does not require them to be individual bigots.
Go ahead. Keep going. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so I'll come with the question. So
yeah, I'm sorry. that was the end of my thoughts.
You're going to build on that. So what jumps out at me is the question then of this feeling and this tool of threat and officer safety. Go into that. And so how does that both support and explain their propensity to use violence in the course of their business? And what's the answer? What's the solution? Or what changes ought we be talking about and thinking about?
Sure. So there was one thing that was really influential early on in my work. This was after Eric Garner was killed, and when John Liu and Rafael Ramos, two NYPD officers, were murdered in their car by a man from Baltimore who was upset by the killings of Brown and Garner, and then took a bus, I believe, and killed the two officers, executed them in their car. And there was an NPR story, I believe, that I heard shortly thereafter. And I think the gist of the story was they took a video. It might have been the Garner video, but point being, it was a video of officers using violence against a black person. And they showed it to an officer and they showed it to someone who wasn't an officer. And the point was pretty straightforward, which was that officers see those videos very differently than someone who's not trained to be concerned about the same things that they are. And I think that that might be useful for listeners and readers to understand, is that when they see an interaction, they might just see somebody on the sidewalk who's shivering, it's cold outside, but an officer sees somebody with their hands in their pockets, and that might be them holding on to a weapon that's going to kill them. Mm-hmm. And that's not me being dramatic. That is how they are trained. They are trained to understand that you need to see their hands because it's the hands that kill you. And if you can see their hands, they don't have a weapon in them. That is a fundamentally different way of looking at the world and looking at people than you or I have. And so this way of seeing the world, it extends far beyond hands, right? Somebody who's nervous. Officers traditionally are expected to understand that somebody being nervous is more than them just being nervous talking to a police officer. It might be because they are nervous about the drugs they have in the car or the weapons that they have in the car. They may be nervous because they're gearing up to try and attack that officer. So all of these often very natural reactions that people, in particular people of color, have when they encounter police can readily be interpreted as potential signs of threat. And that is then addressed by police, usually preemptively. They don't wait for you to attack them. They pull you out of the car. They detain you. They put you in handcuffs. If you begin to resist or ask questions, why are you pulling me out of the car? I didn't do anything. Why did you stop me? I'm just walking. I didn't do it. Suddenly that becomes passive resistance. Suddenly things escalate. Next thing you know, you have a YouTube video. And so these are relatively mundane interactions many of the time. They don't usually end in grievous injury or death, but these are daily interactions, daily uses of violence and coercion. And they are, again, as I mentioned earlier, very, very often within the bounds of policy and law.
Well, and from, say, the community point of view, in certain parts of the community more than others, it's a description of occupation, of an occupation policy, and that law enforcement, therefore, if the goal is to serve and protect, the question is who's being served and who's being protected. And too often the perception is it's protect them against us, that we are perceived as the barbarians at the gate, and that their mission is to protect what they perceive as normalcy of ordinary life for ordinary people, that they perceive to be threats to. So, and so what's the training? How do officers develop this kind of intuitive and tactical strategy that is violence driven? You've described how they look at things differently. How are they trained? And if they're trained to see things that way, can they be trained to see things differently? Tie that to a discussion of the other point you made, and that is the point of officer safety, because that's the reason for the training, is to make sure that you're safe and you go home. And the problem is it's often at the expense of somebody else's life or livelihood or comfort, but you've got legal cover for doing what you do because you've got, the job you're doing is real, and it's necessary. But the question is, how do we make these ends meet somewhere where civility, justice, equity are all part of the equation?
So I'm reminded of something that multiple officers said to me that they were familiar with. It's a phrase. It's better to be tried by 12 than carried by 6. And for those that don't know what that means, tried by 12, of course, refers to a jury, and carried by 6 refers to 6 pallbearers of a casket. And what this pithy little adage suggests is that officers, at least the ones that I spoke to, have an understanding that they are going to be forced to make uncertain choices at times, and that they would rather make a mistake that is illegal right? Potentially, say, killing somebody, injuring somebody, and then face their day in court, then fail to act decisively, and as a result, wind up dead themselves. That is wholly out of step with the idea that officers are privileging the safety of the public above their own. Those two things cannot coexist.
You mean
And
privileging they should be privileging
privileging their own safety above that of the public.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
I didn't see officers be told this directly, but there is academy training that seems to accord with it. And you learn from your very first days in the academy that you have chosen to be part of a profession that is profoundly dangerous. One video, which is probably the most famous video that no one's ever heard of outside of policing, is the murder of Deputy Kyle Dinkkeller in rural Georgia, which is now something like 20 odd years ago, which occurred. Now, in that video, Dinkkeller pulls over a speeding pickup truck. It's driven by Andrew Brannon, who is a veteran, or he's a veteran, I believe, of the Vietnam War. And unbeknownst to Dinkkeller, Brennan has been off his medication for a couple of days. And so the video is from the perspective of the dash cam, and you see Brennan get out of the car, and he starts dancing in the street, acting very erratic. And, Dinkkeller's calling to him, to get down, to stop. And then he runs up on him and starts screaming in his face. He's telling him to get back. Eventually, Brandon goes to his car. He's still being yelled at by Dinkkeller, like, get out of the car, get back. And he starts loading a rifle. At the whole time, Dinkkeller has not shot, has not done anything. Eventually, Brandon comes back with a rifle, opens fire on Dinkkeller. Dinkkeller returns fire. He takes cover behind his vehicle. Brandon begins advancing on the vehicle, eventually reloads, comes around the side of the vehicle, and executes Brandon. And it's all caught on footage. It's all caught on the dash cam. You don't see Brandon shoot Dinkkeller, or you don't see Dinkkeller specifically. You just hear and see Brandon pull the trigger. But there's a reason I don't show that video in any talks that I give. And if anybody's going to look it up, super strong trigger warning. It's a horrifying video because you hear Dinkkeller screaming. You hear his last breaths. One officer that I spoke to said that he remembered the sound of gurgling blood. That video is very intentionally shown very often to 20-year-olds very early on in their academy training. It's an example of just how serious you have to take officer safety. If you fail to address a threat decisively, like Dinkkeller did, it could be you on the side of the road dying. These kinds of videos, it turns out, are easier than ever to access because of things like YouTube. So back in the day, departments would trade VHS tapes. Now, if you want to have an example of a stop gone bad, or a domestic incident, or somebody that was seemingly not a threat that then turned into a threat, just hop on YouTube for 10 minutes and you can find a couple dozen videos to show your recruits or to show at lineup training, which I saw myself. Officers were shown videos of fights and things like that at lineup to emphasize to them how dangerous their job is.
Well, let me ask you how officers that you rode along with thought about, described their work and described who they were to you as you were riding with them. And how did they think about you as an academic, as a researcher, and as a writer? What was your feeling? And were you surprised at things you saw, learned, discovered, or things you did not see in the ride along and the research elements of this work?
So I would generally describe officers as very average. They were majority white, particularly in some departments. My Southwest department was the whitest department. The West Coast department was more diverse, but across Black, white, Latino, the handful of Asian officers that I met, they were just generally pretty average people trying to make a living, trying to go home at night. They skewed overwhelmingly male. There were a fair number of veterans, but certainly not all of them were veterans. They skewed conservative in their politics, but I met several self-described liberals. I think that was something that I didn't expect when I began the work, but very quickly I realized these are just like people. These are just people doing a particular job. And they're not heroes and they're not villains. They're just people wearing a uniform and a badge, and they have very special legal powers, and they get a gun, but they're just people. And frankly, if I hadn't gone to college, or maybe if I had gone to the military and gotten out and gotten a degree and been looking for a job, like, policing probably would have looked real good to me too, a pension. And, I think it would have made a lot of sense, actually. And in fact, several of them asked if I wanted to become a police officer and things of that nature. So I say that all to highlight that these are not caricatures. Sure, like more of them than the average bear, like have bald heads and, they do a lot of time on the bench press or the, whatever, but they're regular people. They reminded me of like my conservative friends' dads growing up. As for how they received me,
what did they think you were doing? What did you tell them you were doing? And what did they think you were doing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I don't know for sure what they thought. I know what I told them, which is, so I would normally introduce myself at lineup, which is a meeting before the shift starts, where officers on that shift are counted, usually by a lieutenant who's the watch commander. If it's a weird late shift, it'll probably just be a sergeant. The lieutenant might not be on. And they get their assignments for the day. You're in this sector. You're in this sector. You have the ride along, aka me. And I would introduce myself there. And so I would tell them, my name is Michael. I'm a PhD student at Yale, and I'm writing my dissertation on policing. And what I would often tell them, which was true, was like, look, I've heard lots of opinions on police from police chiefs and academics and lawyers and activists, but I never see a patrol officer on CNN. I never hear from the people that are taking calls.
Yeah, you don't.
And so I'm here to try to understand this by seeing it directly. And I need your help. I need your help to show me what it is that you do and help me understand. And I'm doing it this way because y'all are the experts, and I wanted to see it for myself. And I think many of them appreciated that. Some said as much. They appreciated that I was taking the time, and, midnight shifts are pretty awful. Like, so we're glad you're here. They appreciated me sort of, quote unquote, seeing it for myself. Still, introducing yourself is very different from building rapport or building trust. Some of them, made a lot of assumptions. I was at Yale, and at the time, Yale was in the middle of a lot of protests around race, around racism. And so they think they made a lot of assumptions about me and my politics. And, I'm not saying that they were necessarily wrong, but my job was to kind of close that gap. And so they might make comments like, oh, Yale must be so expensive. Turns out you get a stipend when you go do a PhD. It's actually free. You don't pay to go. And then I would transition and tell them, actually, I'm from Texas, and I went to public schools. I went to public schools my whole life. UT was where I went to my undergrad. And my mom is a veteran. She's an immigrant from Colombia. So is my dad. My grandfather was a cop in Colombia. I was also a male. I was a man. I was a heterosexual man. I was in my mid to late 20s, and I had tattoos. And turns out I shared a lot of interests with them, like weights and sports. And those were things that we could talk about. And so that process of building rapport was very much about closing that social distance, showing them that we are not really so different, you and I. But, they didn't all trust me. I know that much. Some of them probably thought that I was going to write some sort of scathing tell-all, that I was a journalist.
Yeah.
One even a couple of them even joked that I was actually a Fed, aka like a federal agent that was there to, get them all fired. And, it's unclear how much of it was a joke or not. But I do think that over the course of 10, 12 hours, even the most, even the officer with the highest walls, it's tough not to talk to somebody for 12 hours. So we eventually we had conversations.
Well, did you have any tough police work to do while you're doing the ride along? And tough police work to me means situations where there was a potential or actual violence in the line of duty. Did you experience that?
So I never saw an officer get involved in like a full-blown fight, much less a shooting. That's another one of the points that I kind of hit on in the book, is that serious violence is very, very rare in the context of policing. I did respond to a shooting turned murder after the the victim and the shooter were gone. And so they took the victim and put them in a car and drove him to the emergency room. And so I arrived on scene with an officer. We were the first ones on scene. And so I followed behind. He had his weapon out, his flashlight. He was essentially following the blood trail until he found the big puddle. But there was no victim there. So we knew the victim was gone. I saw officers grab people, push people. I saw one officer tackle somebody because there was reports of essentially somebody either breaking into cars or breaking into a house, and that person ended up being like very intoxicated. But as far as directly responding to the violence or dealing with the violence themselves, I didn't see that. I went to a triple shooting that occurred on the West Coast. And again, officers showed up after the shooting had happened, after the shooter was gone. And so they mostly just like closed off the scene and helped the victims and directed EMS and things like that and preserved evidence. But as far as officers directly confronting violence while I was with them, I didn't see it.
Mm-hmm. So back to the theme, the danger imperative, what changes are needed? Before you answer it, let me take a minute, do a sort of a station break here, and we'll come back and get into change that you suggest may be needed to have effective and just law enforcement that honors every individual's desire to come home from work safely, but that also allows people to exercise their responsibility to support the safety of the community at large. We'll come back in a second. I'm Al McFarland. This is The Conversation with Al McFarland. Are you or someone you know recovering financially from the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, or any other reason? If so, help is available. Findhelp.org is a site to find a wide range of resources, including food, medical care, and more. The best part is based on your zip code. Visit findhelp.org, enter your zip code and the service you need. You'll get a map directing you to the organizations that can help you. Help is waiting at findhelp.org. If you need help starting anew, findhelp.org is the site for you. I'm Al McFarland. This is The Conversation with Al McFarland. My guest is Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. He's the author of The Danger Imperative. We're talking about police violence or violence in the society enacted by police and how they are trained or acclimated or oriented to deal with and sometimes deal violently with people. This is a good time, Michael, for you to restate again the meaning of your book, The Danger Imperative. Go and sit with that again, just explain why this configuration comes to your mind as something that the public should be able to put their mind around.
I think that one of the key reasons why I wrote the book was to help people understand the how and why of police violence. I think a lot of folks nowadays, they see a video or they see something happen in the news and they simply don't understand why it's happening that way. It just doesn't make any sense to them. And part of the reason why it doesn't make any sense to them is because they're not police. Mm-hmm. They do not see the world in the same way as officers do. And so what I show in the book is that violence on the part of police officers is actually what you should expect to happen. It's what the institution is designed to do. And the policing institution is fundamentally about sending armed agents of the state to solve problems. Now, they often solve those problems without using violence, but there's always the implied threat of violence. That's why officers can give you commands. And if you don't do it, then they can make you do it. Mm-hmm. Police themselves say that they often think about it as ask somebody, tell somebody, and then make somebody do what you want them to do. And so what the danger imperative shows is that officers wear a sort of lens. I call it the danger imperative, which is the preoccupation with violence and the provision of officer safety at all times. And in turn, that way of seeing the world increases the probability that officers will take concrete steps to ensure their safety. And many times that set of behaviors happens at the expense of the well-being of the public with whom they are interacting and whom they are supposed to be protecting and serving.
And so you said this before, but I'll ask you to say it again, just having had this conversation for the past 40 minutes or so. The notion of violence as the tool and technique, is that both philosophy and training in police work, both in this country and globally? Or are there alternative approaches to problem solving? You used the term that their job is to solve a problem, right? But they're deputized or organized or enabled, empowered to be very direct. I love how you described it. Ask, tell, make. I think you said that right. Ask, tell, make. And it goes straight, it goes quickly, I'm sure. And they're sort of trained to make sure they get to where they need to go quickly because they want to be safe, right? They want the public to be safe. That's their job. So what in philosophy and training could be different, both for the individual workers in the police field, but also for the people that they are to serve? And how can we elevate this work so that this color blindness is not color coded, but it's genuine, where they are operating out of a principle of justice and fairness and equity that's consistent. That's what's the right word for it? That reflects a code of ethics that show up whether they're being watched or not. They're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and they're not using shorthand methods and strategies that may zoom into the point of violence as the ultimate solution. As you were speaking, one of my old friends way back when, and I just never forgot it, made the statement. I'm not sure why he made it, but the highest form of communication is personal physical violence. There was some, I think, crackpot philosophy that he heard, but that was his mindset at the time. This was 30 years ago. And I just haven't forgotten that. And I'm hoping it wasn't and isn't true, that there is better life-giving and life-affirming strategies for communication that don't involve violence and death. What do you think?
So I have some good news and I have some bad news.
All right.
So the bad news is that I have grown increasingly skeptical that we are going to train our way out of the culture and the institutional logics that I write about in the Danger Imperative. Because if I change the training, that doesn't change the tattoos. It doesn't change the understandings of what policing is. It doesn't change any of the other arrangements within the policing institution. And similarly, if I change some of those things and don't change the training, it's all one thing. This is not about a new procedural justice or a new cultural sensitivity training. I'm not saying those things are going to hurt, but the evidence that they're going to change things drastically is very, very thin. Similarly, there's evidence that suggests that if we increase the number of women in policing, we might reduce the use of force. We might actually increase trust between communities and police if we hire more Black and Latino officers. But we're working on the margins here. We're not shifting the center of the institution or its cultural core. And so for me, I don't think that if I was forced to choose with finite political capital and resources, that I'm going to focus on training. That said, I think that there are some low-hanging policy things that I would do. They're related to training. For example, in the book, in Chapter 1, Survival School, I talk about how in the Southwest, I found training documents where they list the work of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He is the self-professed founder of the field of killology. He's a former West Point professor, and he has written a couple of very popular books on combat and on killing. And he claims to be an expert on the psychology of violence. And part of this training says things like, you must become the predator to catch the predator. You can YouTube his trainings. They are, I think, in a word, disturbing. We can just not have that in academies. That's an easy thing to say. You can't and won't do that. You can stop using taxpayer money to send officers to the seminars that he puts on. You can more carefully vet which seminars you're sending officers to. This is essentially an area of policing that is largely unmonitored. Whatever oversight there is very lax. I think those are some things that you could do. Do I think that is going to fix things? No, but I think it will blunt the sharpest edges of the danger imperative. So what do we do? I believe that the path forward is one in which we stop talking about officer safety and public safety as two separate things. I think you can actually do things that enhance safety for the community and for officers simultaneously. And the good news is it doesn't actually require you to dump more money into policing, and it doesn't require you to send officers into harm's way to do them. And they're surprisingly simple things, and we have strong evidence that they work. For example, adding better lighting can reduce crime and violence. Greening vacant lots and fixing the facades of broken down buildings can reduce crime. There's a recent report from some economists that when you increase the number of behavioral health treatment centers at the county level, you actually reduce the number of assaults specifically on police officers. And there's even evidence that suggests if you just plant more trees, you can reduce crime and violence by reducing the ambient temperature. There's a relationship between the temperature of a place and the likelihood of violence happening. None of that requires me to send officers into harm's way. And all of those things are markedly cheaper than expanding the footprint of the policing apparatus. The good news is that those things keep communities safe. And if you can reduce violence in the community, where do officers spend most of their time? In the community. That's better for officers too. So what I would like to see is police officers, police unions, departments getting on board and calling for interventions that don't require them to spend more money, don't require them to spend more overtime, don't require them to do more training, but which can benefit their officers and the people that they are supposed to be protecting and serving.
How does that happen, though, in an environment over the past 10 years, at least maybe 15, of increased police militarization, the fascination with armaments and tanks and big hardware, battlefield hardware and armament? That seems to have been the trend over the past 15 years. That more and more money was being put into, and that kind of tie that into the prison industrial complex train of thought. You have a state of constant siege, and you have to be on guard. And if the consequences, more people get arrested, more people get jailed, somebody's going to look at that process and say, you know what, this rush to jail people is driven by those people whose business it is to house and contain people that have been adjudicated or sentenced. And so the motive then becomes suspect because of the examination of the practice or the results of the practice. How do we get around that? How do you feel about those cities and communities that, in response to the George Floyd and further killings, say that we need to do something more that's around the area of mental health training and interventions, and not try to bring cops with the training and propensity to rely on force, because they want to be safe, and also because the code that we use when in community here, we'll say officer safety is the that's the escape hatch. That's the code. That's how I get out of killing somebody. If I show up in court and say I feared for my life and therefore I killed her or killed him, that's a pass. And that's been the case, it seems to us. Maybe that's not, I'm not speaking of documentation, but that seems to be the way things work. How do we get around all of that and get to, as you said, more things that don't require more militarization and that maybe bring other responses to places we send cops to now? Is that part of your discussion or your analysis?
So I think that we might be butting up against my ability to speak to it with data, but I have strong suspicions about how these things might be accomplished, and it's informed by our history.
Mhm.
I think it's an unfortunate reality that power is never willingly given up. You force people to give up power. And that was true when it comes to civil rights, and that's going to be true when it comes to policing. And those two things are deeply intertwined. And so I would love for big organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, for the Association of Big City Chiefs. I would love for big police unions like the FOP, the Police Benevolence Association in big cities like New York, to support the idea that we should be doing interventions to reduce crime and violence that do not require them to send more officers out into the field, that do not require them to hire more officers, that do not require new and expensive training. I would love for that to be the case. I am admittedly skeptical. I think we might get some local chiefs that are on board, and I think that we're likely going to have to do this city by city, county by county, state by state. But I think that fundamentally, this is going to come down to a matter of political will and political staying power. This is going to come down to people supporting elected officials that make it a part of their platform, and they make it a commitment that they are going to invest in other things besides policing, that are brave enough to stand up to police unions, that are brave enough to stand up to the constituencies that will come out and vote in favor of keeping things as they are and voting against the interests of Black and Latino communities. I don't think there's any easy way around that. I think that what I'm suggesting in terms of non-police interventions, it's useful because it doesn't actually require me to address militarization, as you pointed out.
Mhm.
The police are going to keep doing what the police do, I think, most likely. And so I think for me, what I'm interested in pursuing is a set of interventions and policies that sort of take as given what police are, what policing is, and that is violent. If you take away the guns and the sticks and the handcuffs, you might still have something that looks like the police, but it's not the police, because policing is about distributing state-approved violence. That's the whole point. And so I again grow increasingly skeptical about efforts to sort of change what policing is, because it is violent, and there's a reason it's violent. And sometimes that violence is even like necessary. I'm not going to be Pollyannish about it.
Right.
But I think the issue is that it can be misused,
Mhm.
and that we're sending armed agents of the state to address a whole host of things that, frankly, they have no business being there doing.
Mhm.
Why are they the ones taking traffic accident reports? Why are we sending armed officers to do reports on a burglary that's 8 hours cold and no one's there? Why are they going to a petty dispute between a parent and a child who doesn't want to go to school? It doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of different people that could handle those things. And that's the direction that I want to pursue. And something that I think police can probably get on board with is that this would be taking things off their plate. This would be them doing less. And they would not be going to the same volume of calls where they're being asked to be a warrior, a preacher, a high school teacher, a parent, a counselor, and everything in between.
Michael Sierra-Arévalo, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a great conversation, a lot of good information. So glad to meet you. The book, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, it's available everywhere, released 2 weeks ago, I think.
Yes, sir.
And where can people buy the book?
Folks can find the book on Amazon, anywhere books are sold. You can also find links for it at dangerimperative.com. And if and when you do get the book, I'd love to hear from you. You can shoot me a message at www.dangerimperative.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter at Michael Sierra, and then add an extra A on the end of it.
I will also reach back out to have a follow-up conversation with you. You know, one of the things that I didn't talk about is, and that we can do in the future, is where the question of race comes in from my side or our side. And I'd often, while being critical of police violence and police abuse, live with the idea that if there were just more Black cops, we wouldn't experience the same amount of harassment. But I don't know that that's true. And so that's a discussion for a later date,
Absolutely.
is changing the police force to all women or all Black in Black neighborhoods. Is that the answer? I don't know that it is, but let's have that discussion down the road.
I'd love to.
Thank you,
Al.
sir.
Look forward to it. Thank you so much, Al. Take care of yourself.
Take care. I'm Al McFarland. We'll see you next time.